Being able to swap lenses on your camera opens up limitless worlds of creative potential, but it's easy to find what you like and stick with it forever. Even though I got my first interchangeable lens camera all the way back in 2007, I didn't get an 85mm lens until 2021. And I wish I got one sooner because this prime lens is a prime example of how certain focal lengths can deliver really special results. All of the photo and video samples that you're gonna see in this video were taken with my 85mm lens, which is the Zeiss Batis 1.8. And the Batis really is a badass lens. But this isn't really a review of this lens specifically, but rather of what the 85mm focal length has to offer. So let's focus on that focal. Now, if you do want a review of this lens, I will give a few of my thoughts right now. If you want to use chapter markers to skip ahead past the specifics of this lens, feel free to do that. But otherwise, when it comes to the Zeiss Batis 1.8, which I've had now for about 6 months, it is an amazing lens. It's not the cheapest, but it's also not the most expensive. It's kind of, as far as Sony lenses go, right in the middle. Sony has a cheaper 85 1.8 and a more expensive 85 f1.4, f1.2. The G Master lens, which is their top of the line, and the Zeiss is right in the middle. I got mine on a Black Friday deal for about $900, and overall, it's absolutely amazing. The build quality is great. It's made out of all metal. It does have this little digital display right here, which is actually kind of helpful. It's like kind of gimmicky, but kind of helpful. I like it. It would be sort of easier if the lens just had regular markings on it, but instead you use this display, and it is helpful to let you know what your focal distance is and some certain settings and things like that in the lens. The most important thing though about this lens is that it gives amazing image quality. It is so sharp, but still so like organic and full of life. When I was looking for which lens to buy, I was originally gonna get the cheaper one, and then I kind of wanted to see like, well, the really expensive one seems super nice, but a lot of the reviews that I saw and that I read said that the Zeiss lens had a really specific, like intangible character that you couldn't really put your finger on. And you wouldn't wanna put your finger on it anyway, because then you would smudge up the lens. But that is really true. I can't really describe it to you, but you might be able to see it in some examples that I show. There's something just very special about the image quality, the results that you get from this lens. Now, I mentioned there are a few downsides to this lens, nothing major though. There are no markings on it, which is sort of strange, but you do have a little screen. The focus ring is made out of this rubber material, which does make it easy to grip, but it also makes it like a magnet for dust and dirt. So I'm constantly wiping off the lens, trying to keep it nice and clean. And just as there are no markings, there are no buttons on this lens at all. So there's no manual to autofocus button. There's nothing like that. You have to program it all in your camera, which is not difficult, but it's slightly inconvenient. Sometimes you just want to flip a switch and then have your camera in manual focus or autofocus. And the autofocus on this lens is really great. It's super fast and super silent, but since this is kind of an older lens, I think it's like 7 or 8 years old at the time I'm recording this video, it doesn't have the same autofocus capabilities that modern lenses have. And when doing video, I've noticed that it kind of tends to hunt. It almost seems anxious, like nervous is the way I would describe it. Whereas with a more modern lens, I can lock on a subject and it just stays on that subject. It's not a problem at all for still photos because the focus locks on and it's great. But in video, sometimes you can be moving the camera or the subject will move and you'll see those little like focus adjustments happening. It sounds like a big deal, but it's really not. At least for my workflow, I've been able to work around it pretty easily. You just sort of get to know your tools after you use them for a while, and then you know how to use them and how to work around their limitations. So sometimes I'll just switch it into manual focus to deal with that, or I'll just make sure to select a focus point on a subject that is really high contrast so that the lens has an easier time identifying it and sticking with it. So all in all, an absolutely great lens, and it has helped me completely fall in love with the 85mm focal length. But again, even though right now I'm using a Zeiss lens on a Sony camera, no matter which camera system you're using, if you can change lenses, there's probably an 85mm lens for your camera. And most 85mm prime lenses also tend to have really wide apertures like f1.8, f1.4, even f1.2. But speaking of aperture, this lens has been a portal into me learning that not all f-stops are created equal. For a long time, I really did think that, f1.8 is f1.8, and it's gonna be the same no matter what the focal length of the lens is. And that's not necessarily true. So let's actually take that a little bit further because I risk causing confusion if we don't talk about iris and aperture when talking about an 85mm lens. As you might know, a lens's aperture is what controls how much light gets through the lens and into the sensor of the camera. A wider aperture lets in more light, which is great for lower light environments because it's sucking up more light in the environment. It also gives you a shallower depth of field, while a smaller aperture lets in less light and then gives you a wider depth of field, which means more of the frame is going to be in focus. And neither is better or worse, they're just different ways of using the tools. A portrait photographer might want a really shallow depth of field where only the subject is in focus and the background is blurry, while a landscape photographer might want the entire scene to be in focus from super close to super far away. Personally, as you might know, I like a blurry background with a shallow depth of field, which is why I pretty much always film the talking head parts of my videos at f1.4. Growing up filming on camcorders, the ability to film with a shallow depth of field is still amazing to me, and I will continue to do it forever because I love it. But as I mentioned earlier, the focal length does affect the depth of field. So for super scientific reasons that I definitely understand and I'm just choosing not to bore you with, an f1.8 aperture on an 85mm lens isn't going to give you the exact same depth of field as an f1.8 aperture on a 24mm lens. But of course, a lot of that has to do with how close your subject is positioned to your background. So let's have a compressed discussion on lens compression, which is how close the background appears to be in your final image. It'll make sense, I promise. Here's the same subject with two different lenses at f1.8. At 24mm, which is pretty wide on a full frame sensor, the background looks far away. You can actually pretty easily tell that there's space between the subject and the background. In that same composition at 85mm, the background looks like it's right behind the subject. Both backgrounds do have blur and bokeh, but the difference in compression gives them a totally different feel. A vibe, as the kids say. So in general, higher numbers, longer focal lengths will give you more background compression and make the background feel closer to your subject. And if you're closer to your subject with a wider lens, that wide lens can then start to distort them and make them look unnatural, causing almost a fisheye effect, even if you're not using a fisheye lens. So with all of that in mind, what's so special about 85mm? This is very subjective, of course, but I think that the 85mm focal length gives you kind of the perfect balance of everything. It's great for portraits, it's great for interviews, and there is some really great background blur, background compression, background isolation where there's a very shallow depth of field, but it doesn't seem super unnatural. It's very like pleasing and not artificial, and just kind of has a very special quality that you won't get with a lot of wider lenses. It also seems like, from what I found, basically every 85mm lens is good. Some are obviously better than others, and there's build quality differences, but image quality from just about every 85mm lens is gonna be pretty darn good. It seems like no matter what manufacturer you're talking about, what lens mount you're using, you're gonna get a lens that gives you really sharp, really pleasing images. So what do I use my 85mm lens for? I do love using it for photos and videos, even if it's just for fun, stuff that you'll never see. But for me, the main reason I got it is that it is an absolutely phenomenal B-roll lens for product photography, and that's something that I do a lot of in just about every video that I make for YouTube. It is a bit too tight to use as a talking head lens in this room. It would have to be too far away. I can't put a camera that far away, but it's great for B-roll where I can take a product, set it on the desk, and then start getting really cool, very pleasing images with this lens. In fact, even without mentioning this lens at all, over the past 6 months that I've had it, I've gotten a lot more compliments about my B-roll shots and my insert shots and all that stuff. And I don't think that's a coincidence, but I do think it is a clear indicator of how pleasing an 85mm image can be. Now, of course, a lens is a super personal decision, and a lot of it just comes down to your personal style and what you're gonna take photos and videos of. For me, for many years, I've always loved wider lenses, so that's just kind of what I used and what I stuck with, and I always thought that something like an 85mm lens would be way too tight and it would be too much money to spend on something that I wouldn't ever really use. Turns out I was totally wrong, and by thinking that, I ended up limiting my creativity for a really long time. Plus, I think that the visual contrast between my wider lenses and the 85mm lens is terrific. I think a lot of what helps people to stay interested in a visual medium like video is contrast, is change between different subjects. So having a nice wider shot and then jumping to a tighter shot with an 85mm lens or a 50mm lens really helps build in some visual variety that holds somebody's attention. But if you're like me, and trust me, that would be a very fortunate thing for you to be, you might have a question of, what about a zoom lens? So this is a 24 to 105mm zoom lens, which means I can just move it to right about here and be at 85mm. Why do I need to buy an 85mm lens if I can just take a general purpose zoom lens, put it at 85 and get the same results? Is there a difference? The first limiting factor is going to be that this zoom lens and most 24-105s have a maximum aperture of f4. So here's a quick comparison with my 85mm lens and the zoom lens set to 85mm, both on the same camera. Now, even though the framing and the composition is the same, you should be able to see a pretty big difference between f4 on the zoom lens and f1.8 on the prime lens. But even if I set the Zeiss to f4 to match the zoom, I still think that the image from the Zeiss, the prime lens, is sharper and more pleasing overall. Could just be my personal opinion though. And I'm not knocking the 24-105. I actually really love this lens. It's one of my favorite general purpose lenses. But when you have a zoom lens, this needs to be good at everything from 24mm to 105mm. That's a lot to cover in one lens. A prime lens only needs to do one thing, which means it can usually do that thing really, really well. And I know you might be thinking, but Tom, that's a mid-range f4 zoom lens. What about a higher end lens with a wider aperture? That's a great question. The downside is that very few zoom lenses will cover the 85mm focal length and go below like f2.8. So while there are really great zoom lenses out there, what makes a prime lens special is its specialization. And that was a realization I had to come to on my own journey. The creative options and flexibility that adding an 85mm lens to my lineup is something that I wish I had done a long time ago, and it's really been one of the smartest gear-based decisions that I've ever made. And speaking of smart decisions, thank you to everyone who helps support my channel through Patreon and YouTube channel memberships. And as much as I do love my 85mm lens, 24mm has been my main focal length for many years. To see why I love it, check out this comparison between the Sony and Sigma 24mm f1.4 lenses right here.